Welcome back. Today we will start with speech segmentation. This is our lecture 4 of module 3. So, speech segmentation it's something that children infants do automatically. However, this is actually quite a task. And how do you know this is a difficult thing? Just imagine yourself listening to a foreign language utterance, a speech or any dialogue, monologue, whatever. So, the problem here is that unlike the written part of language, acoustic signals do not have any important markers that will tell us where to stop, where the gap between words come. So, then in terms of space, so in the written version of a language, we have space to designate the distinction between two words, but that is not how speech works. In the spoken variety of language, this is not how it happens. And then this actually is a problem, and that is why I gave you the example of the foreign language. So, you need to know where the one word ends and where other word begins. Now, this is important because just knowing the difference between speech sounds is not the same as knowing the difference between words, and that is what ultimately the infant needs to do. Knowing only the sound differences will not really work. So, now the question that we are facing is that what cues do infants use to segment the speech stream, because they ultimately eventually do. So, what do they probably use? So, there are many theories and there are many proposals depending on the phonological cues and other cues. So, we will look at them one by one. One of the most common understanding is that infants use prosodic cues. Now, what is prosodic cue? Prosodic cue refers to the rhythm, stress pattern and intonation of the speech. So, every language has its own kind of a rhythm pattern, stress pattern and also the intonation pattern. So, based on that children probably find out the word boundary, that is one of the ideas. So, because each language has its own pattern and based on that you can figure out where the word. So, it is the word final position or word initial position, where does the rhythm, where does the stress occur, that could be a very important indicator. For example, there are two main types of stress pattern, one is called the trochaic system, the other is called the iambic pattern. So, in case of trochaic pattern, in case of English language for example, you follow this, it will sound like doctor, headache. So, the first part of the word gets the stress, the most stress. So, that is why it is called the strong weak pattern. Strong weak pattern is called the trochaic pattern. So, strong followed by weak stress, again strong followed by weak stress, like that. Iambic on the other hand is the opposite. So, weak and strong. So, weak stress followed by the strong stress. There are some words in English which follows this, for example, giraffe and then trapeze and so on. So, this is how the prosodic cues go. Now, using this, infants can potentially learn how to segment the speech stream. So, if English infants assume a strong weak combination as a word, which is more common pattern in English, then they can accurately predict the segmentation. So, they know when the strong followed by weak means that is one word, and then there will be a gap, then again the same pattern will repeat. If that is how they understand, then they will be able to segment. This is known as the metrical segmentation strategy. It was proposed in 1988. Now, there are lots of experiments that have been carried out in this line. One of the most famous is the 15 set of experiments done in 1999. These studies showed that English learning infants are sensitive to the strong weak stress pattern and can use it to segment the words from a continuous speech stream. There were series of experiments, 15 to be precise. One of them, in one of the experiments, what they did was they had 7-month-old infants, and those infants were familiarized with words containing trochaic stress, some words like that we saw in previously. So, doctor, like that. So, trochaic stress as in strong stress followed by the weak stress. So, strong weak pattern is trochaic pattern. Children were 7-month-old infants were familiarized with the set of trochaic patterned words, and not in isolation, but within a text. So, embedded in a text. So, they were listening to texts which had words in the trochaic pattern. In the test phase, they listened to words in isolation. Some of those same words, some of them some were unfamiliar words, and they were listening listening to the words in isolation, what the results showed is that they listen to familiar words for longer than the new words. So, this is the comparison between the familiar words which had trochaic pattern and the unfamiliar words which had whatever pattern, but the difference was this, and this was taken to be a proof of the children identifying the patterns. The same group also carried out other kinds of tests. Another was carrying out familiarization with monosyllabic words and then testing them on disyllabic words. Now, monosyllable and disyllable will have different kinds of stress pattern even if the same word appears in the disyllabic form. So, king, ham, and then you are testing them on kingdom and hamlet. So, when it is king and ham, the stress pattern will be one kind, and in case of kingdom that will be different. In this case, the infants did not show any preference for words containing the familiar monosyllabic words. If the previous example we had familiar versus non-familiar, the familiar one had a particular kind of a stress pattern and they showed preference for the familiar words. Here what they tried to check is it familiarity or is it something else that is making them look at the familiar words for longer time. Here the infants did not show any preference for words containing familiar monosyllabic words. The reason and the justification for this finding that was given was, it is not the sound of the word, meaning the familiarity is not what is happening here, but the stress pattern that the child identified, because the stress pattern of the same thing changed in the disyllabic format. So, now they are not able to identify the format and hence they could not recognize the same words in the disyllabic form. However, there are problems with this kind of findings. First and foremost, this will not work in those languages where stress pattern do not provide a reliable cue for word boundary. There are many languages in the world which do not follow a very simplistic, very cut and dried kind of a stress pattern for word boundary. So, for example, one of the Eskimo languages, the words may vary on stress pattern in different conditions, different depending on different positions and other cases. So, the same word might have different stress patterns. So, then it is not a very reliable stress in this case is not a very reliable cue for the for identifying the word boundary. Right. So, there is a large number of languages that do not have word initial or word final stage stress pattern that can be used reliably for word segmentation, because languages differ across the world, languages differ and each language has their own pattern. In some cases like English, stress pattern is a very reliable cue, in other languages it may not be a very reliable cue. Right. So, for those languages Cutler suggests infants might be using other strategies. Right. What other strategies are we talking about? There are many others. So, another idea that has been put forward is called the phonotactic regularities. Now, what previous one was prosodic pattern, now this is phonotactic regularity. Now, phonotactic regularity refers to the system that sound and sound combinations are allowed. So, system of sound and sound combinations that not every language has same kind of sound combination allowed. For example, in English V, Z and G combination is not allowed, but this is possible in Russian, or if the most famous example could be Polish. So, in case of Polish language, the kind of consonant combination that is allowed is not allowed in most languages of the world. English does not allow, or any other Indian languages also do not allow that kind of a combination. So, this is what phonotactic regularity means. So, because of this pattern, if the child is aware of this pattern, then probably they will be able to understand. Similarly, the BR combination, BR combination is used more often in the word initial position in English language and NT more often in the word final position. So, this kind of combinations, what is allowed and what is allowed in which position, this is what creates our phonotactic patterns in a language. So, if infants are sensitive about the combination and it is in its allowed position, then they can use it to segment words. So, there have been a lot of studies that have looked at this idea and they have found proof for that as well. One of the most well known is the study carried out by Matisse et al. So, the study this is where they looked at infants whether they are sensitive to phonotactic regularities. So, what they did was they presented them with syllable sequences that varied in probability of their occurrence within words. So, the paradigm here used was head turn preference, which we have already discussed before. So, based on this paradigm they created some nonsense syllable, nonsense words, non-words, and they had this CBC pattern of syllables and bisyllabics. They were all bisyllabic, CBC and CBC. So, two syllables here, and they were in this, they were consonant verb consonant, consonant verb consonant cluster. This is how the patterns were created. So, there was a lot of there was a list of bisyllabic words that were created, all were non-words, and what they did was the variable number 1 was the non-words bore primary stress in either the first or in the second syllable. So, the stress patterns were changed. So, either basically either trochaic or iambic. So, weak strong or strong weak kind of a pattern. So, syllables differed on this, bisyllabic words differed, non-words differed either on triambic pattern or iambic pattern. The second variable that they tested was the phonotactic nature of the cross syllabic CC cluster. So, you see CVC, CVC. So, that is this CC cluster that is coming between, that is what was the variable 2. They were trying to check where the kind by manipulating the kind of clusters they wanted to say if this is if this works to identify word boundary. So, clusters had high low probability, high versus low probability, the slash means versus here of occurring in the either within word or between word position. So, they also manipulated those syllables depending on the clusters. Some clusters had a higher probability of appearing in word inside word, and others had a higher probability of occurring between two words. So, inter word location. So, for example, NGK is more common within words or at syllable boundaries, but NGT is more common inter words at word boundaries, right. So, if NGT is a NGK is a cluster, that means it is a single word. However, if you hear NGT cluster, that means it is a boundary marking cluster at the end of the word. Now, this is how they manipulated the stimuli. What they found out, the subjects were 9-month-old infants. What they found out was that the infants showed different kinds of behavior pattern with respect to the two types of clusters, meaning roughly meaning that they understand the difference. So, they showed a pattern of proof of understanding the differences, and they could cluster them depending on the cluster could help them get the word boundary. That was our phonotactic regularities. The third kind within this is within the larger we can call it phonological bootstrapping. So, within this larger domain we have another, the third type is called the allophonic variation. Allophones we all know the different modifications that a phoneme takes based on the environment, the acoustic environment. So, the position of the of a word, of a sound based on what is preceding or following it, that is how the sounds change. We give the example of pa sounding like pa in the word initial position in English, or ta becoming ta in the word initial position, like that, that is an allophone. So, this variation refers to the different pronunciation of the same phoneme in different acoustic environment, that is different positions in the word. So, like pa and ta, etc. So, this is a very subtle case of correspondence between manifestation of a sound and its position. So, in English if you are hearing the ta sound, but that means it is at the beginning of a word. So, automatically you will know the word boundary. So, again studies have been carried out, and they found that infants can differentiate between aspirated and unaspirated sounds, something like pa, pa. So, they set out to find if infants can use this to locate the word boundaries. So, first they found out that the infants are sensitive to the aspiration as a marker, as a marker of difference between sounds, and then they wanted to see if this understanding leads to understanding the word boundaries. So, again by the same group they looked at, they used conditioned head turn procedure as the paradigm. So, speech sounds play only when the infant turns head towards a flashing red light above the speaker, you know the drill. So, same thing. So, in the familiarization phase, infants heard the word nitrates or night rates. Okay. So, you see what is happening here is that the same words put together, almost same words put together in a single word versus two words, but the children never heard both of them together. So, they were hearing either nitrates or nitrates along with many other filler words like doctor, Hamlet, etc. In the test phase, they heard passages that included both the words. So, initially they heard only the words, that was the familiarization process, and then in the test phase, that is the second phase, they heard those words embedded in a sentence context. So, sentences like businesses try to use night rates to send their packages. So, for example, we have this here embedded here, night rates. Similarly, here this starts at the beginning, similarly again at the end, and then so this you can see they have also modified the position of the words that they were trying to check. So, businesses try to use night rates to send their packages, night rates are something that everybody needs, and so on. What did they find? They found that infants are not expected to understand, of course, infants are not expected to understand the sentences, but then what they found out was the children who had been familiarized with nitrates listen longer to the same word in the phrase, same for night rates. The effect was seen in case of 10.5-month-old babies, but not in case of 9-month-old babies. So, there was a slight difference between the age group of the infants that took part in this experiment, and based on the age there was a slight difference in the result that they had. So, 10.5-month-old kids could find the difference, but then the 9-month-old babies could not find the difference, which means this understanding, this sensitivity grows with time. So, that is what they concluded, the sensitivity to allophonic cues develop between 9 and 10.5 months of age, because in this case if you have seen that they have changed the position of the words based on the embedded in the sentences. So, this is allophonic cues, fine, they understand, they do understand, but it takes a little bit of time to develop. So, we see that infants are sensitive to prosodic cues and allophonic cues, but being sensitive and using them to segment words are not the same thing. That is what is our primary issue here. Also, over reliance on these cues can lead to missegmentation. If you are if the infant completely bases his or her understanding of segmentation entirely on these kind of cues, then this might also lead to problems that can be called overgeneralization, because not always this will not always work. For example, aspirated ta occurs not only in the word initial position, but also in the word internally, like atomic. Now, atomic is not here, the sound here is not in the beginning, however, even here the ta sound will be aspirated. So, these are certain cases where the rule set rule does not work. So, these are exceptions, but if we use a generalized pattern to understand this, there will be an error, that is what we are trying to say. So, hence babies need to also know where the cue is useful for segmentation and where it is not. Also, the pattern of cues differ across languages. So, the one particular format will not apply to all the languages. Now, this brings us to a very curious kind of a problem. In order to know the relevant cues for a specific language, infants need to learn some amount of words. Only after you have some amount of data, just imagine how the machine learning or all these artificial agents are trained. The more data that you train it with, the better the outcome, in the test result, the better will be the outcome, the fit will be better. Same thing is applied for humans. So, when in order for the child to understand where the cue is important, where it is not, where it works, where it does not, they need to know a few words at least, they need to have some amount of understanding about the words in the language. and to know the words they need to learn the word segmentation, word boundary. So, this is a catch 22 situation. So, for example, in order to use trochaic stress pattern for to segment English words, English infants need to know that trochaic is specific to this language. That is what can be understood as an example. So, one possible answer to this problem is that they start by using different cues which help them to learn a few words. Once a few words are there in the vocabulary, by different cues we mean probably a set of cues. It could be allophonic, it could be prosodic cues, it could be any of the three that we have already talked about. So, once those cues are used and this way or that way the child gets to understand a few words, has kind of figured out a few words and then using it as a base on top of that they build up the later understanding of the rest of the vocabulary. So, they use those to learn the language specific cues like stress pattern etc. Then those cues are used for learning more words. So, you learn few words, understand the pattern and use the pattern to understand more words. That is kind of a that is the one of the hypothesis. So, based on this idea the theory of isolated word was proposed. What does it mean? What does isolated word mean? That children actually learn isolated words in the initial phase of their life. How to go about finding whether this works or not? There was a rather well known study carried out in 2001, where they explored this idea that of studying what English learning children actually hear. So, for these studies they analyzed transcripts of mothers talking to their children, because the primary thing they were trying to find out is do they actually learn isolated words? Are isolated words part of their ambient language? How many isolated words do they hear in the initial stages of their life? If they hear adequate amount of isolated words and eventually they also identify adequate number of isolated words, that could be taken as a proof of this there being a kind of a correlation between these two. That was the idea behind this experiment. So, the mothers with their first born infants under 9-month-old age that they were chosen. This duo was visited at home every 2 weeks while the infant was between 9 and 15 months of age. So, starting at 9 months till the child was 15 months of age, this experiment went on. The experimenters will visit the home where the mother and child will be talking, mother will be talking to the child, and that was recorded. They had total of 14 visits. Mother's speech with the child was recorded as she went about her normal life. Sessions lasted for 90 to 120 minutes. Out of that entire session, only the middle 75 minutes from 3 to 4 sessions for each child were used for the study. Infants aged before 12 months age sessions were called the early transcript, after 14 months were called the later transcript. So, the first phase and the second phase. So, before 1 year and after 1 year, slightly after 1 year. Early transcripts were used to assess the maternal speech to the infants, whereas the later transcripts were used only to assess the infant's productive vocabulary. Because you see this is after 14 months. So, this is the time after 1 year children are already using words, single word or 2 word stage. So, depending on the child. So, that is when they were looking at the output, and in the stage before that 9 month 12 till 12 month they were checking the input that they were getting in terms of the mother's speech. The early transcripts were analyzed to determine the frequency and diversity of isolated words in the maternal speech. And isolated, how do they define isolated words? Isolated words are those that has a minimum of 300 millisecond gap. This is crucial. So, there has to be a gap of between at least 300 millisecond before and after the word. Those will be considered isolated words. That means, that is adequate cue given to the child that this is a word in itself. This is not a part of another word. 300 millisecond is a lot of time when you are talking about normal speech rate. So, that is how they also put it. So, they reported 9% of isolated words among all the utterances. This is not a very short, very less amount. There was plenty of use of isolated words that the infants could hear at that stage of life. It was also found that those words were the first words learnt by the infants. So, when they compared this with the output, the speech production by the children, by the infants, they found that there was a strong correlation between the words that they produced and the words, isolated words that they heard in the first stage of life. This result showed that a child's ability to produce words at 12 months was correlated with the frequency of isolated words produced by the mother. Hence, they concluded that this is possible that infants begin to learn words from the isolated words that they hear, and on the basis of which they can figure out the other phonetic and phonological cues, on the basis of which they go about segmenting further words. That is the idea. However, there are disagreements to this theory as well. One of the problems pointed out by the other group is that the difference between isolated words and isolated phrases. Sometimes the phrases could also be considered as words. This is quite a common finding among infant speech, that the word mummy and mummy hen might be considered as similar. So, both are considered words. At that stage, children probably are they able to differentiate between short phrases and words? That is the question here. So, if they don't know that difference, then they will learn a lot of phrases as words. So, that in itself is not a big problem, since that is how they actually learn, but when it comes to word segmentation, that is a problem, because the phrasal structure will have a different kind of stress information, whereas the words will have a different kind of word segmentation, because we started with the idea that words will have prosodic cues, on the basis of which you learn more words. Now, if children are taking phrases as words, then they will be following the wrong prosodic cue to segment other words. This is where the problem lies, because stress pattern between words and phrases change. Now, there is another possibility that has been put forward to take care of the previous problems. This is called transitional probabilities. Now, this one takes care of the statistical understanding. This looks at the whole problem, thinking it in terms of statistical probabilities. What are the probabilities of certain kinds of sound combinations to appear in the word initial, final, word boundary positions? That kind of an understanding, if the child has, then they can use that understanding. So, the idea here is that the infants are clever statisticians who can keep track of probabilities of sounds co-occurrence. What kind of sounds can co-occur? For example, if one hears the syllable pre in English, what are the probabilities that the next syllable will be T? Because in English, pretty is a very common word, very high frequent word, and it is also quite commonly used by mothers with infants. This is a pretty flower, this is a pretty dress, kind of thing. So, this is very common, as a result of which this is something that the children are probably expected to learn. So, they know that pre can be followed by T, but the probability of T being followed by babe is very low, as there is no word like tea babe in English. That is what the idea is. So, unless it occurs only in a phrase like pretty baby. So, where tea and babe come together and creates a phrase in some sense. In the continuous speech stream, this might look like a combination. So, the transition between tea and babe happens only between words, not within. However, pre and T, that transition happens within words. Now, this kind of a statistical understanding where which kind of probabilities are higher for word boundaries and which are not, that statistical understanding is expected by the child by this theory. So, the transitional probability talks about this. So, if infants are capable of understanding this, it can be used as a cue to segment words. This kind of sounds like almost improbable, because we don't, a child who is not even able to speak properly, is not even able to segment words, assigning them lot of statistical potential might be a little far-fetched, but seems there are some proof of it as well. So, there were some studies where one of them is that 8-month-old English infants could identify transitional probabilities between syllables in continuous stream of nonsense speech sounds. This is what they found out. There are many other studies that have followed up on this. We are not going into the details here. I will add the references, you can look up. So, there are adequate amount of studies today available that prove that probably the mind can work on a statistical model as well. The infant brain actually can figure out what kind of possibilities are more probable compared to other possibilities. So, these are one. The other kinds, these are all tied with some sort of either phonetic or phonological ideas. So, this is we can consider all of them in some sort of a phonological bootstrapping, because using phonological properties or phonetic properties of the language of the cues that they get, they are trying to we think they are trying to segment the continuous speech stream into word bound to words and finding word boundaries. The other kind of theories talk about the possibility of using meaning as a source to help the infants. So, this is also called semantic bootstrapping. Semantic bootstrapping is not used only for word boundaries, but in syntax as well, as we will see later. But roughly we can say that semantic bootstrapping is also one of the when we are using meaning, then we can call it semantic bootstrapping. For example, Barbara Lass talks about what if language is not learned perceptually, but conceptually. When you are talking about perceptual understanding, we are talking about the acoustic cues and other phonetic, phonotactic regularities and so on. So, those are perceptual properties, but what if children learn language conceptually? So, when you think about concepts, we think about meaning. So, that is what semantic bootstrapping is all about. So, this essentially says that infants probably determine the meaning of the language first. With the help of this, they finally crack the rest of the word. So, how do they figure out meaning? It is actually not very difficult for infants to understand meaning of at least a few words. Which words? The words that are typically used around them very often in their childhood, and the designated object is also present in the same environment. This happens with some words like mummy, for example. This is a word that children learn very early in life, and because also the object is the referent is always present. So, the mummy is always there. So, these are some other words like this can be understood easily and learnt easily, because the object of reference is already present there. So, this could be the beginning of using concepts to understand crack the rest of the language. That is what the idea is. Based on this, the multiple cues approach has been proposed. So, this idea says that children actually use a lot of different kinds of cues, not one single cue, and one of them could be meaning. So, a new approach by Levin and Ambridge suggests that infants need multiple cues to help them sort the issue at hand. When infants hear a sound pattern with an object they know well, they tend to learn it as a word. Rather than waiting for the phonological cues and so on, they match these two early in life, very early in life. So, toys, certain things like mummy and others. So, that sound and object pair is always present, and hence the chances of learning those things as a one entity, as one particular thing, word or whatever they understand as one unit is quite the probability of learning this is quite high. So, this way meaning can help learn the initial words, and then stress pattern related cues can help them learn more words. So, that is the approach that multiple cues approach talks about, that both semantics and phonetic and phonological cues will come together to help children understand or figure out the word boundaries. This is where we complete the lecture 4, and in the next lecture we will talk about speech production by infants. Thank you.